I'm going to talk about the how and why of continuous delivery, continuous deployment for small teams and individual developers. I hear a lot of talks, maybe like the last one, that kind of talked about bleeding edge big things. He even said, don't do this if you're on a small team, which is probably appropriate for Kubernetes operators and for many other parts of what we hear about. We like to hear stories from Google and Netflix and these mega corporations that are doing really amazing and exciting things with continuous deployment and automation. But I want to kind of flip the table around and talk about the other extreme of that and where and when and how and why it makes sense to do that for much smaller teams. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. My name is Jonathan Hall. I'm a DevOps evangelist of sorts, Agile practitioner, Go developer, and I like to dance salsa sometimes. So that's my introduction to myself. Quick show of hands. How many in the room are software developers of any sort? It doesn't matter. Even just writing simple scripts counts. Keep your hands up. How many of you use continuous integration and or deployment in your day job? Keep your hands up. Put it down if you don't. It's pretty good. I'm impressed. How many of you also, keep your hands up, code in your spare time? Almost everybody, okay? And how many of you use CI or CD in your spare time projects, whether it's open source or personal projects? Yeah? I'm impressed. It's about half of the group. That's pretty good. All right. So I just joined, you can put your hand down now. You can keep it up if you want. Keep that blood flow going. So a little bit more about me. I just recently joined a company called Lana, which is Spanish for wool, which in Mexico is slang for money, which is cool because we're a payment service provider for Latin America. We are hiring remote if you're looking for work. Lana.xyz is the domain name. Talk to me afterwards, I can give you more details. Specifically Go developers, site reliability engineers, things like that, even some front-end stuff. This will take you to a page that has my notes from tonight's talk. I'll try to put the video there when it's ready, so that should be easy for everybody. Until September, I was working at Bugaboo. I managed their e-commerce development team, and I've been a developer pretty much my entire career with a back-end and ops focus. Storytime. I started my first development job in about 2006. And I was hired as a network administrator, network engineer of sorts. My interview consisted of a whiteboard and the owner of the company saying, we just bought 3 HP DL360 servers, and we want you to install a spam filtering service on these. Show us how you do it. And so I drew some random lines on this whiteboard, and they said, that looks good, we're hiring you. We want you to put those random lines into our data center. A week later, the developer who had been hired at the same time as me quit. And they hired a new developer. And within a month of me starting, we released our first deployment with our new team. It was a pretty small team. I think there were 3 of us. It was me, the developer, and a support guy. So it was a really small team. But we released our first deployment after the new team was formed. And it broke every single customer's server. Now, this was before cloud. This was really, AWS existed, but it wasn't popular. So we were shipping software to customer servers and installing it. The install process consisted of them essentially downloading a .ini file, seeing if a version had changed. If it did, it downloaded a tarball, it unzipped it, and hoped that everything worked right. And in this case, it didn't. This happened at the Black Friday, which I was in America, which is a big deal. It's kind of a big deal here, but this was in 2006. It was still already a really big deal then. So this is literally the day after Thanksgiving, the second largest holiday in America. And every single phone line, we were a small company, like all 6 phone lines were lit constantly that day. Every person in the company was answering the phone, from our developers to our normal support staff, to our salespeople, to our janitor. What broke that day was an execute bit had not been set on the script. That was the entire breakage, was one execute bit hadn't been set. Probably what happened is the developer had it set on his local machine. When he converted it to Subversion, it didn't get set in the metadata in Subversion. Then when it got checked out and compiled and everything, it just didn't get set. That's probably what happened, I don't know. Um, we've probably all done something kind of like this. Hopefully you didn't break hundreds of customer servers, but I know I'm guilty of always missing some mundane detail. If you haven't, I really want to know your secret. So yeah, it took us several days to fix this. We had to physically SSH into every server and switch that execute bit. And then over the next coming weeks and months, we discussed why did this happen? And not just the execute bit part, but like what about our system failed? What fundamentally broke that we could have solved to do this? Or we could have solved to keep this from happening again. I'm going to put the story on hold for a little bit now. I think because of the title of the meetup we're at, we kind of have an idea that continuous delivery or deployment or something like that could come to the rescue of a situation like this. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about what continuous delivery, continuous deployment looks like to me. These are some images that I created for a blog post I wrote. Link will be at that QR code if you follow that later on. So that this is kind of, the top one here is kind of modeled after a Git flow type of process. Your developer maybe creates a pull request, it gets merged into some sort of development environment. Maybe it's just a branch, maybe it's not an environment, maybe it's just a branch. Hopefully some sort of QA happens on it. Then maybe it goes into staging for user acceptance testing. Then you finally get merged into master or trunk, whatever your system calls it. Probably write some documentation, and eventually you actually deploy it, the customer can see it. We didn't really have most of this in the scenario I just described. We definitely didn't have any QA. We definitely didn't have any acceptance testing. And documentation, if it existed, was pretty haphazard. It was just when we felt like it, we wrote some documentation. But if this is all working correctly, you could call it continuous deployment, continuous delivery, right? Another step or another approach, one I like a little better. I try to push all of the manual steps, QA and acceptance testing, before a single merge rather than having multiple stages, not a dev step and then a staging step. I like to push everything up there. That's a detail for another time. The point is, I think you can get the idea that we needed some automated steps in our process, and we had literally no automation at all. Maybe, I don't know, I hear a lot, I don't know if anybody agrees with me on this, I hear a lot of talk about, I think this is what most people have in mind when they first hear about continuous deployment and delivery. They think about how to automate as many of these steps as possible. How can we automate our QA? How can we automate even documentation, maybe with Swagger or something like that if you're writing an API? And to do that requires a certain amount of overhead that I think is one reason that large teams get a lot of the attention when it comes to continuous deployment, continuous integration. And that's what I want to challenge a little bit tonight. So what I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of this talk are things that I do on my solo projects. I have a couple open source projects I maintain and some hobby projects. And I use, if not every single one of these practices, most of them on each of my individual projects. And my theory is if I can scale it down to a project that I work on in my spare time, it can work on a team of 2 people or 3 people or 6 people. You don't need Google to be successful at these things. So going back a little bit in concept to those 2 charts I just showed you, trunk-based development is one aspect of CI/CD that I think is really important. And people are laughing. Yeah, so trunk-based development, just to be, not to go into detail and get the weeds too much, but trunk-based development is the idea that you have a single long-lived branch, usually called trunk or master, depending on whether you're using Subversion or Git. So these days, probably master-based development would be a better name. But you have a single long-lived branch, and you make feature branches off of that and merge them back into master when you're done. Rather than the idea of having multiple long-lived branches, such as master, development, staging, test, and so on and so forth, that at different stages in the process get merged back into each other until eventually they get deployed. Again, I'm not going to go into a lot of details on that right now, but this is a simple, relatively simple concept that I think makes a lot of sense for a small project. And I've heard some people claim that it doesn't make sense on a solo project, and I disagree with that also. it feels like maybe too much overhead to bother with pull requests when you're working on a solo project. And I understand why you would say that, but I still do pull requests on my own solo projects, and I review them myself. I admittedly don't review them as thoroughly as I review someone else's code, but at least I have a point in time when I'm reminded by the tools I'm using that I should be reviewing my own code. And it's very common that I find mistakes in my pull request, or maybe the most common mistake I find is some debug code I forgot to remove, or something simple like that. Yeah. So I encourage you to use trunk-based development in all your projects, but especially in maybe starting with your solo projects. Automated testing gets all the attention, I think, at least initially, when you start talking about automating your deployment, because that's the obvious place. It's called automated testing for a reason. So unit tests, end-to-end tests, API tests, all those sort of things are obviously a great thing to put into your continuous integration pipeline. But they make sense for solo projects too. I've seen a lot of projects, in fact, even the company I just joined 2 weeks ago, they have some unit tests, but they don't get run automatically. And I'm sitting there going, why do you have these tests if you don't bother running them? I mean, there's another debate to be had about whether tests should exist or to what extent they should exist, but if you have them, at least run them. And I feel the same about your solo project. If you're going to write an open source widget for something, for WordPress, if you bother to write tests at all, please run them automatically. It's not that hard to configure GitHub Actions or GitLab or Travis CI or whatever. Just run your tests. And the sooner you start this practice, the easier it is as your team grows. So maybe you're a small startup to start with. In 5 years, maybe you have 80 developers working for you. The sooner you start these processes, the easier it is to adopt them later. It's just so much harder to train people, and technically it's much harder to start adding tests and automation later on. So automated testing is a great thing to do. Let's move on. So quality assurance and acceptance testing. This one may not apply as much for small teams, which is maybe why it often gets overlooked, but I want to be cautious about overlooking that, because the truth is these things do happen in practically every project. The question is, do they happen intentionally or do they happen accidentally when your end user, which may be you if it's a solo project, is the one testing it. So I really like to be intentional about, this is another reason pull requests are useful on solo projects, is because it's a time to pause and test your code, even if that means firing up your server or starting up your WordPress instance or whatever it is you're playing with, and just testing it from, it doesn't have to be necessarily thorough, but take a moment, pause, test your software before you hit merge, and see if it works. I've written a blog post, link here, also on the QR link, which kind of takes an intentionally extreme view of deploying continuous deployment without using continuous integration, sort of as a thought exercise, that we can move all of our manual processes, and especially quality assurance and acceptance testing, before that merge button is pushed. So yeah, that's one thing I think that is far too often overlooked on small projects. Part 2 of that, this is taken from the blog post I just mentioned. If you're using Gitflow or typical multi-stage deployment process, you'll often have this. You have a feature branch, you'll merge into a staging environment, maybe multiple times if you find bugs or things to be fixed, and eventually merge into master. At least on paper, my proposal is very simple. This staging is just it's an ephemeral branch. It doesn't merge anywhere. It just dies. Every time you merge to staging, you do your testing in there, and then you throw it away. This works really well on a solo project because you have no contention for that staging environment. Once as you add a second developer, then you have to start talking to each other, like, are you testing something right now or not? So that doesn't scale up, but it does scale down very well. When you start getting to larger teams, then that's when review environments, which I'm not going to talk in detail about, but the idea that each feature branch fires up its own environment becomes really nice. I actually did this on some of my solo projects too, partly just because it was sexy. But it is nice if I'm ever working on 2 things simultaneously. I don't have to worry about balancing my staging environment between multiple features. Yeah, so I've not talked about everything in continuous deployment and delivery, but yeah, I guess pretty high level. I feel like it's really, really valuable to take these practices down to a small scale. And I think I've already talked about most of the points I wanted to on this slide anyway. The main thing is that the sooner you start with these practices, the easier it is to get started. It's always harder to retrofit any of these practices on a larger team, both technically, just because there's more moving pieces. Once you have 16 dependencies, it's harder to get them all working together in an automated fashion. And maybe more important, the human aspect of training everybody that we're doing things in a way now is harder. It's easier if you can do that as they're joining the team. So yeah, I encourage everybody to scale down your CI/CD if you're not already doing that. So some final notes on the story I told at the beginning. We basically did the things I described. The exception being actually continuous deployment, ironically, because we were deploying to customer servers. I guess technically we did continuous delivery. We went from this magical INI file and tarball deployment system to Debian packages, and those were automatically built and uploaded to the server automatically. So everything except the final deployment onto the customer server was made automatic. We implemented unit tests to a large extent on our software. We started doing pull requests, which hadn't existed before. So yeah, we really went from the Wild West cowboy style coding in 2006 to, by the time I left there in 2015, fairly modern, by 2015 standards, CI/CD installation. That project died a few years later, sadly, but the story continues because we're all still working on new software. So yeah, I think that's the end of my presentation. I guess it's a little shorter than I expected, but if there's any questions, I would be happy to try to answer.
If you look at your QA, you could use Selenium for that part?
So at Bugaboo, for example, where I was recently working, yes, we did.
I mean for your solo projects.
For my solo projects, no.
You're talking about scaling down.
The only reason I don't is because I'm really bad with front end stuff. Okay. I've played with it and I've looked at it and I want to, but I haven't taken the time to learn. Like, my JavaScript knowledge is from like 2008, like ES4 or something. So just learning the new frameworks has been a challenge. So that's really the only reason I haven't. I've wanted to.
That would help to automate everything. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I did, actually, so back on that story I told, I did write some front end unit tests in JavaScript. That was before Selenium existed. And those were the only unit tests we had that weren't in our pipeline because it wasn't easy to run headless tests back then. So I had basically a feature toggle that I could, if I wanted to, go to the website, load the test. Hey, what was it? QUnit, I think was the tool I was using. If anybody remembers JavaScript from 100 years ago, then I think that was the tool that was in vogue back then. And it would just run this test and give me an output on the screen. So that's what I did back then. I do deploy, I'll finish my statement and then I'll get to you. I do deploy to my personal projects to Google Cloud on Kubernetes. Not because it really makes sense, because it probably doesn't for a solo project, but it's fun and it integrates really well with GitLab. If you're starting a simple project, especially if it can be deployed in Docker, GitLab has a feature called Auto DevOps. It kind of handles that review environment thing I was talking about, just kind of out of the box for you. If you have a bigger project, it'll be a lot harder to shoehorn it in, but for small projects, it's great. Okay, first you and then you.
So could you give an example of one of your solo projects?
Yes. I'm working on working is almost an overstatement. I have been working on a mobile app for language study. Because I learned Spanish, then I learned Portuguese, and I was trying to learn some Dutch when I moved here, and I've kind of given up, but one day I'll pick it up again. So I've been working on an app to kind of help with my vocabulary practice. And so I wrote, so that's one example. So that includes an Android app built with Cordova, and then a web app that runs essentially the same software, just on a website, right? So that's the main personal app. Part of that is an open source library I've written a Go driver for CouchDB, which I also use these principles except the final continuous deployment because it's just a library, but it's on GitHub, and so I still have all those automated processes in there. And you?
Yeah. Although you mentioned GitLab, do you use the standard feature of the platform that you store your code on, or do you use dedicated environments for your CI/CD, like Jenkins in the cloud or Travis or whatever?
I currently use GitLab for everything. I run my own runners because I don't have minute limits that way, and you can get a VM for €3 or €4 a month with unlimited minutes. So why not? I was using Travis initially for my open source library, and it was working fine. But then when I needed this for my private project, I didn't want to pay $60 a month for Travis when I could go to GitLab for $4 a month. Actually, I think GitLab is free, even for private projects, plus this €2 a month for a VM. So that was the reason I switched initially. By now, I've switched almost everything to GitLab just because it's nicer to have a single platform. Although I've recently started using GitHub Actions, and I don't know if I like the flavor, but they're very functional, so personal preference there. Anything else? All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.